We are likely to hear which are the three or four motions that could be accepted by the Speaker for MPs to vote on. Well, joined by Deputy Political Editor of the Daily Mirror, Ben Glaze, and Guido Fawkes reporter Tom Harwood. Hello to you both. Nice to see you again. Thanks for joining us. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, everything's really up in the air. We've seen that over the last 2.5 years, the House of Commons has continually voted against almost every option, apart from two. They voted to invoke Article 50 and thereby set no deal as the legal default, but also they voted for that Malthouse compromise, that Malthouse A option, which was to seek legal changes to the backstop. Changes were sought. Some argue some were achieved, others argue not many were achieved at all. But ultimately, the option that has had the most votes up to this stage that is achievable is Theresa May's deal. It achieved more votes than any other option in last week's indicative votes.
Lost by plenty, though.
It still lost by a lot, which shows how tricky the situation is for everyone involved.
Votes?
That's right, that's right. So it'll be interesting to see whether anything comes closer today. But what you might see is if an option like the customs union, which you were suggesting earlier, might be tacked on to the withdrawal agreement. Well, one of the reasons why Brexiteers find the withdrawal agreement such a tricky proposal to get behind right now is that it contains the potential for a permanent customs union, definitely within the backstop and within the political declaration, this single customs territory that has scared off a lot of Brexiteers from backing it. If that becomes a definite, we might see more people slipping away from their support from the withdrawal agreement, and it might throw up more questions than answers.
Tom says that Prime Minister's deal obviously lost by 58 votes on Friday. That's correct. But let's not forget the 230 votes it lost by in January and the 149 votes it lost by early this month. This evening, I think we're going to see MPs rally behind the customs union option put forward by Ken Clarke, assuming Speaker John Bercow picks that.
So you think Labour will rally around that as well?
I think they'll be whipping for that to
come and join us.
Customs
Lewis
union.
wasn't sure
I suspect
about that,
there'll be
were
support about it. I think they will. They'll certainly be whipping for Common Market 2.0. This is the Norway-style option.
Sure.
I think if there is support for a customs union, there's going to be a big problem for Theresa May and whether or not she accepts that, because obviously in the 2017 election manifesto, the Tories said they would leave the customs union. Hard Brexiteers are obviously dead against it, but there are moderates on the backbenches of the Conservative Party who will support it. And obviously with the government not whipping junior ministers this evening, you could see dozens of them support the customs union as a way forward.
Shimmy this way a bit, boys, and then we can get Lewis in as well. Lewis, your thought?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt at all that Labour are going to support the customs union tonight. I suppose my point is more, when, assuming that gets a majority, then the meaningful vote can come back. Then does Labour find a way of withdrawing its support? So they've said, oh yes, we're in favour of a customs union now, but actually it isn't quite close enough to our deal. You know, I just can't see Corbyn effectively saying, OK, you can have the customs union and that's it. I think that Labour will clearly find some way of saying it's not quite close enough, give us these more concessions. I just don't see that. I mean, that's not to say that he might not be able to keep all of his MPs at that point from coming in behind it, and maybe finally we'll see some of these much anticipated Labour MPs finally swinging behind it, but it's no means going by guarantee, I think.
And more than that, I don't think the Prime Minister will accept the customs union. These aren't binding votes this evening, and it'd be anathema to everything she stood on for the last 3 years since she went into Downing Street, saying that she's interpreted the Brexit referendum as a vote to leave the customs union, the single market, and to end free movement.
It's impossible.
So she won't just accept it, no.
And within Parliament, everyone who voted leave, I don't think there's one Brexiteer in Parliament who supports customs union membership. What's quite interesting is this morning the Conservative Home website put out a survey of Conservative members, and actually what was found was that the customs union was the least popular option. Even EEA membership, this sort of Norway model, is more popular than membership of the customs union amongst Conservatives, which is really telling, because that ability to strike free trade agreements that comes out of leaving the customs union is one of the biggest prizes of Brexit, and to throw that away would really hurt the idea of Brexit, and most Brexiteers would see that as an ultimate betrayal.
Interestingly, Jason O'Mahony has tweeted us this afternoon. He's a columnist with the Times, the Ireland edition, and saying, quick question, does Ken Clarke's customs union keep the UK in the regulatory alignment with the EU? I don't think it does.
No, it wouldn't. No, because we'd be leaving the single market. So, I mean, I think Labour's idea is effectively that we'd be in a single customs territory, the customs union, and then keep a very high degree of alignment. So not technically in the single market, which would mean we wouldn't have freedom of movement, but we'd basically align our rules to the EU more or less anyway.
Which is basically the backstop.
Which is basically the backstop.
Which is extraordinary why they have been opposing this deal that is up to a word, what their proposal for Brexit has been for the last few months.
But on the other hand, the European Union say they don't really want to actually implement the backstop for a long period of time. It's not a permanent status, it's just a sort of holding mechanism. So I think from Labour's point of view, they just think that, you know, we need something more permanent. Of course, the big problem is, I mean, one of the sort of other big chimeras of this debate is Labour say they want something more permanent. But almost anything that is agreed in the next couple of weeks, assuming something is agreed in terms of the political declaration, is completely potentially ephemeral and could just disappear straight away, because you'll have a new Conservative Prime Minister who comes along and says, I don't like that political declaration at all, we're starting again. And so that's the big problem.
Yeah, well, especially if there's a general election. You know, the Prime Minister made a promise last week at the dispatch box to accept a backbench Labour amendment to give Parliament a bigger say in stage 2 of the negotiations. She's made that promise a couple of days after saying she's not going to be around to negotiate stage 2. It's not her promise to make. You know, it's just... It gives a sense of more chaos, really. And, yeah, the Prime Minister's promise in that respect, you know, is written in the air.
Tom?
Around this, I mean, what do you say? There is no option that looks good for any faction right now. The Labour Party might be backing a customs union, but then they'll have to do this peculiar manoeuvre to then withdraw the support, as they did with the withdrawal agreement last week. You've got Brexiteers who are now peeling away from the withdrawal agreement, as it looks like the Commons is shifting towards a customs union.
You're referring to ERGers that said that they were sorry that they voted in the way that they did.
Exactly, and we're starting to see a trickle of that this afternoon, which is really worrying for a lot of reasons, because really ultimately it looks like no deal has been taken off the table. The Prime Minister has said that there's no way that she'll allow no deal to happen without Parliament's consent, and Parliament voted against it by 202 votes to 412 2 weeks ago. So it's an incredibly impossible position for almost any faction. There's no majority for almost anything, and it does look like we're heading towards some sort of general election, but with a leader that no Conservative wants to lead them into a general election.
It has to be said, a lot of this is of the Prime Minister's own making, all this trouble, because what she should have done at the start of the process, before triggering Article 50, was find out what there was a consensus for in Parliament, and then she could claim that as her own, really. You know, she obviously...
Doesn't look as though there's consensus so much, though, does it?
Article 50 was triggered in a different Parliament, though, and the problem is that when the Prime Minister looked like she was walking on water, when she had the support from all of her MPs, when it looked like she was going to head for a thumping electoral majority, when she was 20 points ahead in the polls, there weren't any of these Brexit problems. This is always called a Brexit crisis. Sky News has this banner, Brexit crisis. It's not. It's not a Brexit crisis at all. It's a parliamentary arithmetic crisis. It's a hung Parliament crisis, and it was...
Tom, it wasn't a hung Parliament, though, until the Prime Minister took the general election, was it?
I think also, I mean, you know, think back to the 2015-17 Parliament. The parliamentary arithmetic was not that dramatically different. I mean, you know, OK, the Conservatives have a majority of 12, but I would say that had that Parliament endured, we would be in a very similar place now, except that what would have happened now is we'd have had an election, or be on our way to election.
That's assuming that the Prime Minister would have lost her authority in the same way that she did in 2017.
The majority of 12 is not. OK, if we talk over each other, viewers don't know what's happening. Yeah. Tom?
It's bigger than just the numbers. It's the confidence of the MPs. And the confidence that MPs lost in Theresa May after that election, it was after the election that people started to suggest that a second referendum could be possible. It was after that election when people started to suggest we could stay in the single market. These are the ideas that have come out of a political vacuum that was created by that election, not out of Brexit.
The withdrawal agreement would probably have been very similar, irrespective of that general election, though, don't you agree?
No, because the withdrawal agreement is a function of this cowardice over Northern Ireland.
But how would it be different?
It would be different because, number one, the Conservative Party wouldn't be reliant on the DUP's votes.
Well, the country would still be divided.
How would the content have been different?
Well, the Prime Minister would have had that credible threat of no deal that she could take to the European Union and push them much harder on issues. We wouldn't have been forced into signing up to that December agreement that was the creation of all of these worries.
You might be right. You may be right.
Let Ben come in.
You say it was Article 50 was triggered in the previous Parliament. It was obviously true, but it was only previous Parliament because the Prime Minister decided to call that general election because she couldn't resist that fluctuating but at one point 20-point poll lead. So that was of her own making. What she should have done upon becoming Prime Minister was seek to find that consensus. And if the consensus turned out to be for a customs union, she could have said, right, well, we'll have a customs union. You wouldn't have this chaos in Parliament that we have every day now, and she could have, you know, she wouldn't be in this humiliating position of having to essentially this her own deal if it's a customs union. Yeah, because
the problem is
because that wasn't the option.
Boys, don't talk over each other, please.
When it was They voted against the customs union when it wasn't the government's position. Had it have been the government's position, as set out by the Prime Minister after she'd arrived at that through consensus, then it's not sure, there's no guarantee that Parliament would then have voted against the customs union.
OK, anyway, we are where we are, and we've got potentially these 4 motions this afternoon, or more or less. What do you think? What do you think he's going to put forward or allow MPs to vote on, and how do you think it's going to go? Given that last week there were 8 and none of them got through.
Well, the Speaker has a history of tending to pick motions that Brexiteers see as not being particularly advantageous to them. So there's a question as to whether he'll pick John Barron's No Deal amendment, but if it is picked, it's likely that it will be defeated
B, no
yet
deal
again.
in the absence of a withdrawal agreement.
Absolutely. Joanna Cherry's proposal is a very interesting one, and which is to revoke Article 50 if Parliament votes against No Deal yet again, which it would.
With 2 days to go before we fall out without a deal.
Exactly, and this is a really curious amendment because it's meant that Remainers have dropped any pretence of being Democrats at all. They always used to pretend that we would have a second referendum. Oh, we just want to find out what the will of the people is. It really means that the mask has slipped for a lot of them, and showing that really this has only ever been about stopping
Joanna
Brexit.
Cherry, of course, SNP. Ben, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Tom's actually there. This People's Vote campaign, it's not for a second referendum. It's a bit to thwart Brexit.
That's
really
not Joanna
is.
Cherry, by the way. Go on.
So I agree with that. I think in the same way that there's no majority in the House for a no-deal Brexit, I don't think there's a majority to revoke Article 50 because MPs get a very bad reputation, and as journalists we obviously fuel that, I accept, but they're all doing their best in there. We should remember that. They're doing their best to try and arrive at something that they feel is delivering Brexit, the majority of them, because they do accept that the country voted, 52% to 48% to leave the European Union. That was a democratic vote, and most of them want to deliver that. The method of delivering that is obviously what's causing all the chaos and the fiasco at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I think that what was really interesting to me is that does there come a point where clearly the Labour Party's been on a real journey towards, I mean, it wasn't so long ago that the idea of Corbyn backing a second referendum or ratification referendum seemed very unlikely. He did it last week. He's going to do it again tonight.
Took him long enough.
Took him a long time, but, it has been a gradual process. Is there a point where we had Hugh Merriman on a little bit early on this afternoon, where Conservative MPs start to actually say, look, actually, is the only way that this place... We don't want a general election. We don't want a general election because, we're really worried we're going to do very badly and we're going to lose our seats. Is there a point where they say, you know what, and I'm not talking about the ERG here, I'm talking about the body of Conservative MPs, start to think, we'll take the PM's deal to the country. Because at that point, and it wouldn't take that many of them with Labour support, SNP support, it wouldn't take loads of them for that to start to become a real live prospect.
Well, privately, some of the Tory MPs I've spoken to, they say they're not happy to contemplate a second referendum, but some of them make the argument that were there to be a second referendum, Remain shouldn't be an option, because they say the country has opted to leave. The country didn't decide how it leaves.
Oh, if you had that, then it would be very likely. I'm sure quite a lot of them would back it, but obviously Labour and the SNP won't back it unless Remain's on it.
And what's very interesting is in opinion polling that's taken about the public attitude towards a second referendum, there is consistently no majority for a second referendum that is explicitly about the option to remain within the EU. The only way that the second referendum campaign has been able to manipulate majorities for this proposal is when they make ambiguous language and overtures towards this idea of having a say in what kind of Brexit there will be. So the only support in the country that there has ever been is for a potential vote in the future between something like May's deal and something like the WTO.
What is the point? What is the point, do you think, Ben, of really having these motions and these votes? Because the Prime Minister has said that she's not going to accept them anyway.
Well, the idea all along has been to try and find something around which MPs can rally.
Here's hear from the Speaker.
The ayes to the right, 322, and the noes to the left, 277.
The ayes to the right, 322. The noes to the left, 277. So the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Unlock.
OK, so as expected, the business motion has passed. So let's hear what he's saying, because he's going to tell us which of the motions he's going to accept.
From and future relationship with the European Union. I inform the House that I have selected the following motions for decision by recorded vote. Motion C in the name of Mr. Kenneth Clark. Motion D in the name of Mr. Nicholas Bowles. Motion E in the name of Mr. Peter Kyle. And motion G in the name of Joanna Cherry.